On a summer morning in the year 1485, two armies stood facing each other on the fields near Market Bosworth. One was led by a king determined to defend his crown, the other by an exiled claimant whose right to rule was fragile at best. By nightfall, Richard III, the last of the Plantagenets, lay dead among the fallen, and Henry Tudor wore the English crown. The Battle of Bosworth was not just another clash in the Wars of the Roses. It was the end of an era, the death of a dynasty, and the beginning of the Tudor age that would shape England for the next century. The story of Bosworth is one of shifting loyalties, dramatic twists, and a final charge that has echoed through history. Richard rode boldly into combat, determined to strike down Henry himself, only to be betrayed at the most crucial moment. Henry, the exile who had spent most of his life far from England's shores, suddenly found himself the ruler of a kingdom weary of war, but not yet ready to embrace him fully. From the battlefield crown placed on his head to the careful marriage alliance with Elizabeth of York, his journey was a mixture of luck, determination, and ruthless calculation. Yet Bosworth is more than the tale of two men. It is the story of how civil war reshaped the monarchy, how propaganda turned Richard into a villain and Henry into a savior, and how one day in August set the stage for the rise of the Tudors, including the famous reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Welcome to our channel Words of Time. In this video, we will uncover the dramatic events of the Battle of Bosworth, explore how Henry VII rose from exile to the throne, and understand why this moment changed the course of English history forever. In the closing decades of the 15th century, England was a kingdom marked by turbulence, factional rivalry, and dynastic struggle. The reigns of Henry VI, Edward IV, and Richard III had left the crown weakened by uncertainty and civil conflict. The monarchy was not only a symbol of authority, but also the keystone that held together the fragile political order of the realm. When that keystone appeared unstable, ambitious nobles seized opportunities to advance their claims, leading to a cycle of rebellion and retribution that destabilized the country for decades. Against this backdrop, the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 emerged as more than just another clash of armies. It became the turning point that ended the Wars of the Roses and marked the rise of a new dynasty under Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII. The Wars of the Roses were essentially a struggle for the throne between two branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white rose. These conflicts, which began in the mid-15th century, were driven by more than bloodlines and symbols. At the root were questions of legitimacy, the personal weakness of Henry VI, and the ambitions of powerful noble families who used dynastic disputes as a cover for their own advancement. The conflict saw violent swings in fortune. At one moment, the Lancastrians seemed secure, only to lose ground to the Yorkists. At another, the Yorkists looked unassailable, only to be weakened by division among themselves. The Wars of the Roses were not a single war, but a series of battles, conspiracies, and shifting alliances that stretched across more than 3 decades, leaving scars on the kingdom and creating an atmosphere of constant instability. When Richard III took the throne in 1483, he was already burdened by suspicion. He had declared his nephews, the sons of Edward IV, illegitimate and had assumed power as king. The disappearance of those princes from the Tower of London became one of the most infamous mysteries in English history and damaged Richard's reputation irreparably. His reign was marked by unease, and while he attempted to strengthen his rule through patronage and governance, he never fully gained the trust of his subjects. Many nobles who had once supported the Yorkist cause began to look elsewhere for leadership. This created the opening for Henry Tudor, a relatively obscure exile with a tenuous Lancastrian claim, to emerge as a viable alternative. Henry Tudor's claim was far from strong. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, descended from John of Gaunt, a son of Edward III, but through a line that had been legitimized under specific conditions. Few would have considered him the natural heir to the throne. Yet Henry's advantage lay not in the strength of his bloodline, but in the weakness of Richard's position and the widespread yearning for stability. While in exile in Brittany and later France, Henry gathered support from disaffected English nobles, loyal Lancastrians, and foreign powers eager to see Richard weakened. His promise to marry Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, also gave him the potential to unite the warring houses, providing a vision of reconciliation that appealed to many. The Battle of Bosworth was the culmination of these forces. On that field in Leicestershire, Richard III led an army larger and more established, but his reliance on the loyalty of magnates such as Lord Stanley and his brother proved fatal. Henry, with a smaller force composed of French mercenaries, Welsh supporters, and loyal followers, faced daunting odds. Yet the battle unfolded in a way that highlighted Richard's miscalculations and Henry's ability to inspire key defections at the critical moment. Richard made a bold personal charge aimed at killing Henry directly, a decision that displayed courage but also desperation. The intervention of the Stanleys on Henry's side sealed Richard's fate. Richard was killed in the fighting, becoming the last English king to die in battle, and Henry was proclaimed king on the field itself. The importance of Bosworth lies not just in its outcome, but in what it represented. It ended the direct conflict between Lancaster and York by removing Richard and allowing Henry to consolidate power through both conquest and marriage. It introduced the Tudor dynasty, which would reign for over a century and oversee some of the most transformative periods in English history, including the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Henry VII's reign was not only about survival, but about creating the conditions for lasting stability. Through careful management of finances, restriction of overmighty nobles, and strategic alliances, he laid the foundation for a stronger monarchy that could withstand challenges that had undone his predecessors. For contemporaries, Bosworth was the moment when decades of civil war finally ended, although resistance and pretenders would still trouble Henry in his early reign. For later generations, it became a symbol of the shift from medieval to early modern England, a decisive point where dynastic chaos gave way to centralized authority. The battle is remembered as much for its drama, the fall of Richard, the rise of Henry, as for its consequences. Shakespeare would later immortalize Richard as a villain undone by fate and ambition, reinforcing Bosworth's place in cultural memory as the scene of poetic justice. Yet beyond the literary image lies the historical reality. Bosworth mattered because it marked the end of an old order and the start of a dynasty that reshaped the monarchy and the nation. By the time Henry entered London as the new king, the people of England had endured decades of conflict. Many were less concerned with whether his claim was perfect and more with whether he could bring peace and security. The crown he placed on his head, said to have been retrieved from a bush after Richard's fall, was not just a symbol of victory in battle. It represented the possibility of a new beginning. The story of Bosworth is therefore not only about two armies and a single day of combat, but about the hopes and fears of a nation weary of war and longing for stability. In that sense, the battle was indeed pivotal, shaping the course of English history for generations to come. The story of Bosworth and the emergence of Henry VII cannot be understood without following the path of conflict that consumed England in the 15th century. The Wars of the Roses were not a single war, but a sequence of rivalries, shifting allegiances, and bloody encounters that left the crown unstable for more than 30 years. The roots of this struggle can be traced to the reign of Henry VI, whose personal weakness opened the door for noble families to push their ambitions forward and shape the kingdom according to their own interests. His inability to govern decisively created an atmosphere where questions of legitimacy and loyalty became sharper than ever. The conflict that followed, pitting the Lancastrians against the Yorkists, did not simply bring armies to the field. It fractured communities, brought suffering to ordinary people, and destabilized institutions that had once seemed immovable. Henry VI had come to the throne as an infant, following the long and successful reign of his father, Henry V. The contrast between father and son could not have been greater. Where Henry V was remembered as a warrior king whose victory at Agincourt gave the English pride and confidence, Henry VI grew into a man who struggled with decision-making and suffered periods of mental illness. His passivity allowed great nobles to dominate the political stage, often at the expense of the crown's authority. Powerful figures like Richard, Duke of York, and the Beaufort family positioned themselves as kingmakers, and their rivalries grew increasingly bitter. When the Hundred Years' War ended with England's defeat in France, the sense of national decline only deepened. The once proud territories in Normandy and Gascony were lost, and England was left isolated. Soldiers returned home to a kingdom already strained by poor leadership, and frustration with Henry's failures fueled dissent. The stage was set for confrontation between the two great houses that claimed descent from Edward III. The House of Lancaster, to which Henry VI belonged, held the crown but lacked strong leadership. The House of York, through Richard, Duke of York, argued for a superior claim, and presented itself as a force for reform and order. As tensions escalated, the kingdom split into factions. Each noble family had to choose sides, not always based on principle, but often for survival and self-interest. Feuds between local magnates in the shires mirrored the larger national conflict, creating a climate of unrest that pushed the kingdom toward war. The First Battle of St. Albans in 1455 marked the outbreak of open conflict. Richard of York and his allies, including Richard Neville, the powerful Earl of Warwick, clashed with the Lancastrians in the streets of the town. It was not a massive battle by later standards, but it was significant because it showed that disputes could no longer be contained by negotiation. Yorkist forces captured Henry VI, making him a puppet under their control. This early victory emboldened the Yorkist cause, though it did not resolve the question of succession. For years afterward, skirmishes, shifting loyalties, and political maneuvering kept the kingdom in a state of unease. The decisive engagement at Towton in 1461 gave the Yorkists their strongest claim to dominance. It was one of the bloodiest battles fought on English soil, with accounts suggesting tens of thousands of casualties. Edward, the son of Richard of York, emerged as the victor and was proclaimed Edward IV. Towton cemented the Yorkist hold on power, but it also deepened the bitterness of the conflict. The Lancastrians were not extinguished. Henry VI and his queen, Margaret of Anjou, continued to fight, drawing support from loyal nobles. The cycle of war was far from finished, and though Edward now sat on the throne, his reign would face serious challenges. Edward IV was a striking figure. Tall, charismatic, and militarily skilled, he commanded loyalty on the battlefield. His reign began with promise, especially after his triumphs over Lancastrian forces. He secured the throne more firmly by defeating Henry VI's remaining supporters and capturing the former king, who was later imprisoned in the Tower of London. Edward's ability to win battles gave him authority, but peace was not easily maintained. His decision to marry Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of relatively modest noble status, shocked his court and alienated some of his most important allies. The marriage elevated the Woodville family, giving them influence that rivaled the traditional magnates, and this shift in favor created tension within the Yorkist ranks. At the center of these tensions was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, often called the Kingmaker. Once a staunch ally of Edward, Warwick grew increasingly resentful of the king's choices and the rise of the Woodvilles. His own ambitions and frustrations led him to switch sides, a move that would destabilize Edward's rule. Warwick allied himself with the Lancastrians and even restored Henry VI to the throne briefly during the period known as the Readoption. For a time, England seemed to be pulled back into Lancastrian control. Yet Edward proved resilient. With the support of his loyal brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, he returned from exile, gathered forces, and reclaimed his crown. Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet in 1471, and Edward secured victory again at Tewkesbury, where the Lancastrian heir, Prince Edward, was slain. With Henry VI soon dead in the Tower, the Lancastrian line appeared extinguished. Edward's second reign was more secure. He managed to impose stability, strengthen royal finances, and maintain peace within the realm. Yet his court remained divided. His younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, was executed for treason after repeated betrayals, showing how fragile family loyalty could be in this period. Edward's sudden death in 1482 created a vacuum that would throw the kingdom back into turmoil. His heir, Edward V, was only a boy, and questions of regency and guardianship became urgent. Into this uncertainty stepped Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward's loyal brother who had fought with him in earlier years. Appointed protector, Richard at first appeared to be safeguarding his nephew's interests. Yet within weeks, rumors spread that he intended to claim the crown for himself. The young king and his brother were lodged in the Tower of London, ostensibly for safety, but they soon disappeared from sight. Richard declared Edward IV's children illegitimate, citing an alleged pre-contract of marriage that invalidated his union with Elizabeth Woodville. With the princes removed, Richard was crowned Richard III in the summer of 1483. Richard was an able administrator and a capable commander, but his seizure of the throne and the mystery of the princes in the Tower cast a shadow over his rule. Many saw him as a usurper, and suspicions about the fate of the young princes haunted his reputation. Although Richard attempted reforms that limited corruption and improved access to justice, these measures did little to erase doubts about his legitimacy. Discontent grew, especially among nobles who had once been loyal to Edward IV. The instability of Richard's reign created the space for Henry Tudor to emerge from exile as a credible challenger. Though Henry's bloodline was weak compared to others, the climate of discontent and the desire for change gave him momentum. Nobles who distrusted Richard began to see Henry as a safer alternative, particularly after he pledged to marry Elizabeth of York, which would unite the warring houses. By 1485, the conflict that had begun with Henry VI's weakness and the ambitions of York and Lancaster converged once more on the battlefield, this time at Bosworth, where the cycle of rivalry would finally give way to the rise of the Tudors. The collapse of Edward IV's line and the accession of Richard III opened a chapter of uncertainty that many in England found difficult to accept. Discontented Yorkists and surviving Lancastrian sympathizers began to look for a figure who might unite their cause against Richard, and in that search their attention fell on Henry Tudor. At first glance, Henry seemed an unlikely candidate for kingship. Born in 1357 at Pembroke Castle, he spent much of his youth in exile and obscurity. His father, Edmund Tudor, had died before his birth, leaving him dependent on the protection of his uncle Jasper Tudor and his formidable mother, Margaret Beaufort. His Lancastrian claim was weak, deriving through his mother's Beaufort line from John of Gaunt, son of Edward III, a line that had been legitimized under conditions that barred its heirs from the throne. Yet weakness of bloodline did not prevent him from becoming a rallying point, for what Henry represented was less a hereditary right than a potential solution to the turmoil that England had endured. Henry's youth was marked by instability. After the Yorkist victories in the early 1460s, he and his uncle Jasper were forced into flight, first finding refuge in Wales and later in Brittany. The long years in exile were crucial in shaping his character. Cut off from his homeland, Henry learned caution, patience, and the art of survival. His life depended on the goodwill of foreign rulers who were willing to offer shelter, but also eager to use him as a bargaining chip in their own diplomacy. In Brittany, Duke Francis protected him for years, at times resisting English demands for his extradition. Later, when circumstances forced him into France, the French crown offered him not only refuge but also support that would prove essential in his eventual return to England. The strength of Henry's claim lay less in legal right and more in the political context of the moment. Richard's seizure of the throne, and the shadow that hung over the fate of Edward V and his brother, created a moral vacuum. Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, was tireless in promoting her son as a rightful alternative. A woman of remarkable intelligence and determination, she cultivated connections among disaffected nobles and courtiers. Margaret's marriage to Lord Stanley placed her in a position of influence close to Richard's court, even as she secretly plotted her son's advancement. Through her efforts, Henry's candidacy gained traction among those who might not have otherwise considered a man of such tenuous descent. Henry also benefited from the willingness of both Welsh supporters and French allies to align with him. In Wales, the Tudor name carried weight, and his father's memory and his uncle Jasper's reputation helped secure loyalty. The Welsh saw in Henry a native son who might restore local pride and influence after years of marginalization. In France, the crown had its own reasons for encouraging Henry's cause. Weakening Richard meant weakening a neighbor who might otherwise threaten French interests. French financial and military assistance, including mercenary troops, provided Henry with the backbone of the force that would eventually march into England. The years leading to Bosworth were not a straight line of progress for Henry. They were marked by failed uprisings and conspiracies that revealed both the risks of challenging Richard and the growing readiness of discontented factions to rally around Henry. The most notable of these was Buckingham's rebellion in 1483. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, had once been Richard's ally, but his loyalty turned to resentment. Whether driven by ambition, disillusionment, or both, Buckingham plotted with others to overthrow Richard. The plan involved Henry Tudor landing in the West Country, while Buckingham raised forces in the south. Yet the rebellion faltered almost as soon as it began. Poor weather delayed Henry's crossing from Brittany, leaving Buckingham without crucial support. The uprising collapsed, Buckingham was captured and executed, and Henry was forced to retreat once more into exile. Although the rebellion failed, it demonstrated two important truths. First, opposition to Richard was deep and widespread, even among men who had previously supported him. Second, Henry was beginning to be seen as the figure around whom resistance could coalesce. In the months and years that followed, smaller conspiracies and plots continued to unfold. Margaret Beaufort's communications kept Henry connected to English allies, while courtiers and clerics worked quietly to prepare the ground for his eventual return. Foreign aid was central to these efforts. Without money, weapons, and troops, Henry could never have challenged Richard directly. France, eager to maintain influence and to keep England weak, proved willing to fund Henry's plans. Richard, for his part, was not idle. He was aware of Henry's growing support and worked to secure his own position through a mixture of patronage, legal reforms, and military preparedness. He distributed lands and offices to maintain loyalty, attempted to present himself as a just ruler by addressing grievances, and prepared defenses against possible invasion. Yet suspicion dogged him at every turn. The disappearance of the princes left him open to charges of murder, whether justified or not, and his reliance on the loyalty of magnates such as the Stanleys was precarious. His rule, while active and in some ways reformist, never overcame the perception of illegitimacy. By 1485, Henry was ready to act decisively. With French backing, he gathered a force of mercenaries and English exiles. Among his most important supporters were John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, a veteran commander who brought experience and discipline, and his uncle Jasper Tudor, who had long been his protector and mentor. These men gave Henry not only military credibility, but also connections that helped secure broader support. Henry's strategy was to land in Wales, where the Tudor name and Jasper's influence could rally local forces. This plan combined symbolism with practicality. Wales offered a secure base of operations and a path eastward toward the heart of England. The logistics of the campaign were challenging. Moving men, horses, and supplies across the Channel required coordination and secrecy, for Richard's spies were alert. Yet Henry managed to make the crossing, landing at Milford Haven. From there he marched through Wales, gathering supporters as he advanced. The geography of his route was significant. By moving through friendly territory, he avoided early confrontation with Richard's forces while increasing his numbers. Each new ally added legitimacy, suggesting that his cause was more than just a foreign-backed gamble. Richard, meanwhile, prepared to confront the invasion. He summoned his forces, gathering a larger army than Henry could hope to muster. Yet numbers alone did not guarantee loyalty. The loyalties of key nobles, especially the Stanleys, remained uncertain. Though bound to Richard by hostages and oaths, they had connections to Henry through Margaret Beaufort and their own calculations of advantage. Richard's challenge was not simply to defeat Henry on the field, but to hold together a coalition of men whose trust in him was fragile. The march toward Bosworth was therefore more than the movement of armies. It was the unfolding of a high-stakes gamble on both sides. Henry relied on the hope that discontent with Richard would tip the balance, while Richard relied on the assumption that his authority and numbers would overwhelm the invader. Every step Henry took across Wales and into England tested whether his promises of unity and stability could inspire enough support to challenge the crown. By the time the two forces faced one another near Market Bosworth, years of exile, rebellion, conspiracy, and preparation had converged into a single decisive moment. When Henry Tudor finally brought his army across Wales and into the heart of England, the kingdom was braced for the confrontation that would decide its future. Years of plotting, failed rebellions, and tentative alliances had led to this point. On one side stood Henry, the exile who had returned with foreign support, Welsh loyalty, and the promise of uniting Lancaster and York through his marriage to Elizabeth of York. On the other side stood Richard III, a crowned king with a larger army, a seasoned household force, and the machinery of government behind him, yet weighed down by suspicion and mistrust. The field of Bosworth was not simply the ground where two armies met, but the place where decades of conflict were resolved and a dynasty changed hands. Henry's army was modest in number, but diverse in composition. At its core were French mercenaries supplied by the French crown, hardened professional soldiers who provided discipline and experience. Alongside them marched men from Wales, inspired by the Tudor name and the influence of Jasper Tudor. These Welsh troops were joined by a scattering of English loyalists, men who had fled Richard's rule or who had long supported the Lancastrian cause. Most important among these loyal nobles was John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, whose military ability and reputation for steady command gave Henry's forces a backbone. Oxford's presence reassured many that Henry was not merely a figurehead, but had competent leaders to direct the fight. Though Henry's numbers were smaller than Richard's, his men were bound together by hope, determination, and the belief that victory could end years of bloodshed. Richard's army, by contrast, was far larger and included many of the kingdom's leading nobles. His household troops and retainers formed a solid core, and his artillery and cavalry outmatched Henry's. Yet beneath the appearance of strength lay cracks that would prove fatal. Richard had reason to question the loyalty of some of his allies. The Stanleys, Thomas and William, commanded significant forces that could turn the tide of battle, but their intentions remained opaque. Thomas Stanley was married to Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, while his brother William had long been a cautious opportunist. Richard had attempted to secure their loyalty by holding Thomas's son as a hostage, but the Stanleys avoided firm commitment, promising support while keeping their men apart from Richard's main host. The uncertainty over their allegiance meant that Richard could not fully trust his numerical advantage. Morale on each side reflected the leadership qualities of the two commanders. Henry, though inexperienced in battle, inspired hope by presenting himself as the restorer of peace. His promise to unite Lancaster and York gave his followers a vision that extended beyond the day's fighting. He listened to his advisors, particularly Oxford and Jasper, and placed his trust in their guidance. Richard, by contrast, projected confidence and personal bravery, but suspicion haunted him. His men knew that their king's legitimacy was questioned, and that rumors of the prince's deaths lingered. Richard's determination to fight personally was admired, yet his ability to inspire loyalty was weakened by years of mistrust and resentment. The armies finally drew up near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Richard took the high ground on Ambion Hill, a position that gave him the advantage of defense. His forces were arrayed with his vanguard and artillery prepared to check Henry's advance. Henry, approaching from the west, deployed his smaller force with Oxford in command of the main body, while Jasper and other captains organized the flanks. The Stanleys positioned their troops separately, watching and waiting. It was clear that their decision, whenever it came, could decide the outcome. The early stages of the battle saw skirmishes and probing maneuvers. Richard's artillery attempted to disrupt Henry's advance, while Oxford's men moved cautiously, keeping their formation tight. Discipline was critical for Henry's smaller force, and Oxford ensured that his men did not overextend themselves. Initial clashes between Richard's vanguard and Henry's troops were fierce, but Henry's men, supported by experienced French mercenaries, held their ground. The fighting was close and brutal, with arrows, pikes, and swords cutting through the morning air. The turning points began to emerge as the battle developed. Richard, frustrated by Henry's resilience, sought to break his opponent through decisive action. His cavalry, powerful and numerous, attempted to overwhelm Henry's lines, but Oxford's command held firm. He kept his men within a defined area, preventing them from being stretched too thin, and countered each Yorkist push with disciplined resistance. The cohesion of Henry's army, despite its smaller size, contrasted with the uneven performance of Richard's larger host. As the battle reached its climax, Richard saw an opportunity. Henry, surrounded by a smaller bodyguard, appeared vulnerable. Seizing the moment, Richard led a cavalry charge directly toward Henry, hoping to cut him down and end the contest in one stroke. It was a bold and desperate gamble, showcasing Richard's personal courage. His charge cut through part of Henry's escort, and for a brief moment it seemed that Richard might indeed strike down his rival. Henry's life hung in the balance as Richard pressed forward with determination. Yet it was at this moment that the Stanleys intervened. Seeing Richard's charge and recognizing the decisive instant, William Stanley brought his men into the fight on Henry's side. Their intervention shattered Richard's attempt to reach Henry and swung the momentum of the battle. Richard's forces, already strained, began to falter as they saw the Stanleys join Henry. What had been a contest of determination now turned into a collapse of Yorkist morale. The betrayal of the Stanleys was not unexpected, but the timing was devastating. Richard, however, refused to flee. Contemporary accounts emphasize that he fought bravely to the end, refusing to abandon the field. Surrounded and overwhelmed, he continued to strike at his enemies until he was cut down. His death in combat marked the last time an English king fell in battle. For Henry's men, the sight of Richard's body confirmed their victory. The Yorkist lines broke apart, soldiers fled, and the field was left in Henry's hands. The immediate aftermath of Richard's death was dramatic. His crown, said to have been knocked from his head during the fighting, was found and placed upon Henry's head by Lord Stanley, symbolizing the transfer of power. The battlefield coronation carried immense symbolic weight. Henry was proclaimed king not only by right of blood or claim, but by the fact of victory. Richard's corpse, stripped and displayed in Leicester, served as a grim reminder of the consequences of defeat and the finality of the conflict. Reactions on the battlefield were a mixture of relief and exhaustion. For Henry's followers, the victory was both a vindication and a promise of change. For Richard's supporters, it was a crushing blow, not only to their cause but to the Yorkist dynasty itself. The death of their king left them without a leader, and the scale of the defeat made further resistance impossible in the short term. The Stanleys, having judged their moment carefully, were now confirmed as kingmakers, their support having secured Henry's triumph. Bosworth was therefore more than a clash of arms. It was the decisive end to the Wars of the Roses in practice, if not immediately in memory. The death of Richard and the coronation of Henry on the field marked a turning point where legitimacy shifted from one dynasty to another. The battle's importance lay not only in who won but in how it was won. Through discipline, timely intervention, and the collapse of trust in a king who could not secure loyalty when it mattered most. From exile and uncertainty, Henry Tudor had risen to seize the crown. The battle confirmed his authority in a way that no claim of descent could, for it demonstrated that fortune and the will of his supporters had carried him to victory. As the dust settled on Ambion Hill, England's future had changed. The Tudors had begun their reign, and the long years of civil strife that had marked the 15th century had reached their bloody conclusion. The death of Richard III on the field of Bosworth was both an end and a beginning. For Henry Tudor, it marked the culmination of years spent in exile, years of plotting, negotiation, and uncertainty, and the start of a reign that had to transform a fragile victory into lasting authority. His coronation on the battlefield, with Lord Stanley placing Richard's fallen crown upon his head, symbolized the birth of a new dynasty. Yet that moment of triumph was only the first step. Henry faced the daunting task of securing a throne that many still considered beyond his rightful reach, calming a country weary of civil war, and turning his victory into a reign strong enough to withstand rebellion and intrigue. From Bosworth, Henry moved deliberately toward London. His march was both practical and symbolic, allowing him to gather the loyalty of towns and nobles along the way. The people, tired of years of dynastic conflict, welcomed him, but their enthusiasm was cautious rather than unqualified. He was a new king with no long history in England, a man whose claim rested more on conquest than descent. Still, Henry understood the importance of appearances. He made sure his journey to the capital projected authority, order, and the promise of stability. By the time he entered London, he was not simply the victor of Bosworth, but a monarch already shaping the perception of his rule. Henry was crowned formally in Westminster Abbey in October of 1485. The coronation was carefully timed before his marriage to Elizabeth of York, ensuring that his claim to the throne was presented as his own right rather than dependent on his wife's bloodline. This was a shrewd political move. By marrying Elizabeth after his coronation, Henry could both strengthen his legitimacy and unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York without appearing to owe his crown to her lineage. The marriage, celebrated in January of 1486, was a powerful symbol of reconciliation. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were combined into the Tudor rose, a potent emblem of unity that Henry would use tirelessly in his propaganda. The union of the two houses did not erase decades of bitterness, but it gave England a new narrative, the end of civil war and the beginning of peace under a single dynasty. Securing the throne required more than symbolism, however. Henry needed to consolidate power in practical ways. He rewarded loyal supporters, such as the Earl of Oxford and his uncle Jasper Tudor, while carefully limiting the influence of magnates who might threaten him. He summoned Parliament to confirm his kingship, dating his reign from the day before Bosworth, so that those who had fought against him could be branded traitors. Through careful appointments, financial control, and the use of royal progress to assert his presence across the kingdom, Henry began to shape a monarchy that was less dependent on noble support than those before him. Still, his early reign was not without threats. The first significant challenge came in the form of the Lovell Rebellion in 1486. Francis, Lord Lovell, a former supporter of Richard, attempted to stir uprisings in Yorkshire and the Midlands, alongside Humphrey and Thomas Stafford. The rebellion was quickly suppressed, with Lovell fleeing abroad and the Staffords captured. This initial test demonstrated both the fragility of Henry's position and his willingness to act decisively. Mercy was shown in some cases, severity in others, a balance that would become characteristic of his reign. The more serious danger emerged in 1487 with the appearance of Lambert Simnel, a boy trained to impersonate Edward, Earl of Warwick, a true Yorkist heir imprisoned in the Tower. Backed by disaffected Yorkists and foreign supporters, including Margaret of Burgundy, Simnel was crowned in Dublin as King Edward VI. The rebellion gained momentum, with mercenary forces landing in the north of England. Henry responded with care, parading the real Earl of Warwick through London to expose the fraud while preparing his army for battle. The confrontation came at Stoke Field in June of 1487. Though fierce, the battle ended in Henry's favor, crushing the rebellion. Simnel himself was captured and, remarkably, spared, working in the royal kitchens rather than facing execution. Henry's decision to show clemency to the boy while punishing the ringleaders was another demonstration of his careful political instinct. Stoke Field is often regarded as the true end of the Wars of the Roses, as it was the last pitched battle of the period. Yet even after Stoke, challenges continued. The most persistent came in the form of Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the princes in the Tower. Emerging in the early 1490s, Warbeck found support from foreign rulers, including Margaret of Burgundy, Maximilian the Holy Roman Emperor, and James IV of Scotland. His presence was a thorn in Henry's side for years, with attempted invasions and conspiracies troubling the kingdom. Warbeck's appeal rested on the enduring mystery of the prince's fate and the willingness of foreign powers to use him as a pawn against England. Henry dealt with the threat through a combination of diplomacy, military readiness, and political control. By isolating Warbeck's supporters and neutralizing foreign backing, he eventually captured the pretender. Warbeck was executed in 1499 after repeated attempts to escape, removing one of the last serious Yorkist threats. These rebellions and pretenders shaped Henry's reign profoundly. They forced him to build a system of control that did not rely on trust in the nobility. Instead, Henry strengthened the crown's authority through careful use of finance and law. He developed the practice of bonds and recognizances, financial agreements that bound nobles to good behavior under threat of ruinous penalties. This system allowed him to control potential rivals without constant military confrontation. It also provided revenue for the crown, giving him independence from overmighty subjects. By the end of his reign, Henry had created a monarchy far stronger financially and politically than the one he had inherited. Legitimacy remained central to Henry's strategy. Beyond his marriage and the Tudor rose, he used imagery and symbolism to reinforce his authority. The blending of Lancaster and York in heraldry and ceremony emphasized unity, while his careful patronage of the church strengthened his moral standing. He also made use of propaganda to portray himself as the savior of the nation, the man who ended decades of war. His progress across the kingdom, his public appearances with Elizabeth and their children, and his emphasis on dynastic continuity all served to embed the Tudor presence in the minds of his subjects. In government, Henry relied on a small circle of trusted advisors, many of whom were men of ability rather than great birth. Figures such as John Morton, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Reginald Bray became central to his administration. This reliance on professionals rather than magnates helped him reduce the influence of the nobility while ensuring that his government was efficient and loyal. His use of the Star Chamber and other legal tools reinforced the crown's ability to check noble power and maintain order. Henry's cautious and methodical approach sometimes earned him a reputation for parsimony and severity, but it was precisely these qualities that allowed him to survive repeated challenges. By the time he had dealt with Warbeck and other pretenders, his position was secure. He had transformed his initial battlefield victory into a dynasty rooted in stability, financial strength, and control over the nobility. His reign provided the foundation upon which his son, Henry VIII, would build a monarchy powerful enough to shape the course of English and European history. What began with a crown retrieved from a bush on the field of Bosworth had, through careful management and relentless vigilance, become a kingship respected and feared. Henry VII's rise was not simply the story of a victory in war, but of a deliberate construction of legitimacy and authority in a kingdom weary of bloodshed. His reign demonstrated that conquest alone was not enough. Survival required wisdom, restraint, and an unyielding focus on the preservation of power. By uniting Lancaster and York, suppressing rebellion, and reshaping the balance between crown and nobility, Henry ensured that the Tudor dynasty would endure. The reign of Henry VII cannot be separated from the events at Bosworth, for the battle did not simply end the life of Richard III, but symbolized the closing of one of the bloodiest chapters in English history. In the years that followed, Henry carefully cultivated the memory of Bosworth as more than a military victory. It became the turning point at which civil strife gave way to order, at which the long quarrel between York and Lancaster was finally buried. While the reality was more complicated, the perception mattered, and Henry made certain that his dynasty would be remembered as the force that had ended the cycle of dynastic war. The Wars of the Roses had raged intermittently for over 30 years, leaving a kingdom exhausted by shifting loyalties, noble feuds, and repeated battles for the throne. Bosworth did not see the last drop of blood shed in these conflicts, but it represented a decisive break. Richard's death in the field, the fall of the last Yorkist king, and Henry's survival against the odds created a new balance that no pretender could easily overturn. When Henry married Elizabeth of York soon after his coronation, he gave the war-weary nation a powerful image of unity. The red and white roses, combined in the Tudor emblem, declared an end to factionalism, and while this symbolism did not erase the danger of rebellion, it provided a narrative that could be repeated, painted, and celebrated as truth. One of the key legacies of Bosworth was the shifting relationship between the monarchy and the nobility. Throughout the Wars of the Roses, great magnates had played decisive roles, raising armies, switching sides, and in some cases exercising power greater than that of the crown. At Bosworth, the ambiguous stance of the Stanleys, whose intervention at the critical moment sealed Richard's fate, highlighted the dangers of overmighty subjects. Henry learned from this. His reign was characterized by deliberate measures to reduce noble independence. Through financial instruments such as bonds and recognizances, he ensured that loyalty was not a matter of personal preference, but of economic survival. Noble retinues were restricted, private armies reduced, and the crown's control over justice expanded. The lesson of Bosworth was clear to Henry. He had gained the crown in part because powerful nobles had chosen to support him at the right moment, but he could not allow his dynasty to depend on such fragile loyalties in the future. Rewriting the narrative of Richard III's reign also became a cornerstone of Henry's legacy. Richard had already been controversial, his seizure of the throne and the disappearance of his nephews casting shadows over his rule. Henry and his supporters took advantage of this, amplifying Richard's reputation as a usurper and tyrant. Chroniclers sympathetic to the Tudors painted Richard as deformed in body and corrupted in spirit, a king whose ambition had plunged the nation into bloodshed. By contrast, Henry was portrayed as the deliverer who restored rightful order. This contrast was not simply propaganda. It became the foundation of a historical memory that endured for centuries, reinforced by playwrights like Shakespeare, who immortalized Richard as the scheming villain of the stage. The establishment of the Tudor dynasty was not only about suppressing enemies or crafting narratives. It was also about securing a line of succession that could prevent the disputes of previous decades. Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York was central to this goal. Their union produced heirs that embodied both Yorkist and Lancastrian blood, making it more difficult for future rebels to claim legitimacy. Their first son, Arthur, Prince of Wales, symbolized the new dynasty's hopes, though his early death would later shift the burden to his younger brother Henry. Their second son, who would become Henry VIII, ensured the continuation of the line, while their daughters Margaret and Mary created alliances through marriages abroad. In this way, the dynasty extended beyond the borders of England, tying itself into the politics of Scotland, France, and Spain. Henry also worked to strengthen the central authority of the crown. He inherited a kingdom weakened by decades of intermittent conflict, where local lords had often exercised more influence than the king's representatives. His response was a steady centralization of power. He relied on a council of trusted advisors rather than great nobles, ensuring loyalty through patronage and financial dependence. Institutions such as the Court of Star Chamber were used to curb the lawlessness of magnates, while royal finances were carefully managed to give the crown independence from over-reliance on Parliament. Henry's frugality, sometimes criticized as miserliness, allowed him to leave his son a well-stocked treasury, a rare achievement for any medieval monarch. This stability created by Henry laid the groundwork for his successors. When Henry VIII inherited the throne in 1509, he did so not as the uncertain victor of a dynastic struggle, but as the heir of a secure and established dynasty. The structures his father had built, the financial stability, and the reduction of noble independence gave him the freedom to pursue ambitions in war, religion, and politics that would have been impossible for a weaker king. Without Henry VII's cautious consolidation, the dramatic transformations of the Tudor age, including the break with Rome and the flowering of Renaissance culture, could never have occurred. The memory of Bosworth and Henry's reign also became a powerful part of English cultural identity. Writers and historians in the centuries that followed often framed the battle as the decisive end of medieval England and the beginning of a new era. The dramatization of Richard's fall, particularly in Shakespeare's play, created enduring images of tyranny overthrown and justice restored. These depictions, while far from impartial, shaped public understanding of the event long after the actual details of the battle faded from common knowledge. Richard became the archetypal villain, while Henry was cast as the bringer of peace. Modern historians have re-examined these portrayals, questioning the stark contrast between villain and savior. Richard III, once universally condemned, has been reconsidered in light of new evidence and reinterpretations, with some scholars portraying him as a capable, if ruthless, ruler rather than a monster. Henry too has been reassessed. His reign is no longer seen only as a triumph of order, but also as one marked by control, suspicion, and a relentless pursuit of security. Yet even with these reinterpretations, the significance of Bosworth remains. It ended one dynasty and began another, altering the trajectory of English history. The battle itself has also gained renewed interest in recent times through archaeological study and historical investigation. Discoveries about the exact location of the battlefield, as well as the re-examination of Richard's remains uncovered in Leicester in the early 21st century, have brought Bosworth back into public conversation. These developments show how the memory of the battle continues to evolve, blending scholarship with national identity, and reminding us that history is never static. Henry VII's legacy, therefore, rests on several intertwined achievements. He ended decades of civil strife, though not without facing rebellion. He curbed the power of the nobility, strengthening the crown in ways that made England less vulnerable to factional conflict. He created a dynasty that, through careful marriage and succession, endured for over a century. And he crafted a memory of his reign that presented him as the king who brought peace and unity to a fractured land. Even as later generations have questioned or refined this image, the central truth remains. Without Bosworth and Henry's careful rule, the Tudor age, as we know it, would not have come to pass. The legacy of Bosworth is not only political but cultural. It entered the English imagination as the moment when chaos yielded to stability, when a kingdom torn apart by feuding lords was bound together under a single rose. Henry VII, though often overshadowed by his son in popular memory, was the architect of this transformation. His cautious methods, his careful balance of mercy and severity, and his unyielding attention to the security of his dynasty ensured that his victory at Bosworth was not fleeting. Instead, it became the cornerstone of a century of Tudor rule, a period that would see England transformed in politics, religion, and culture. As history moved forward, the story of Bosworth and Henry's rise became more than a record of events. It became a symbol of renewal, of the triumph of stability over anarchy. Even now, centuries later, the echoes of that August day in 1485 can be felt in the way we understand the monarchy, the nation, and the power of memory to shape history. The story of Bosworth and the rise of Henry VII brings us to the close of one of the most turbulent periods in English history. The battle itself was not the largest fought on English soil, nor the bloodiest, yet it has retained its place as one of the most decisive. Its importance lies not only in the death of Richard III and the crowning of Henry Tudor, but in the way it marked the end of dynastic civil war and the beginning of a new political era. When Richard fell, England did not simply gain a new monarch, it gained the chance for stability after decades of chaos. Henry understood from the very first moment of victory that a crown won in battle could easily be lost, and his reign was defined by the determination to make sure that did not happen. The significance of Bosworth rests on three intertwined realities. First, it was the final time that the crown was contested directly in battle by rival dynasties. Earlier conflicts in the Wars of the Roses had been marked by constant shifts of allegiance, bloody reversals of fortune, and monarchs deposed by force. Bosworth ended that cycle. While later pretenders would challenge Henry, none would succeed, and after Stoke Field in 1487, no pitched battle of comparable scale would be fought to decide who wore the crown. The second reality was the end of the Plantagenet line. Richard III was the last king of that family, and with his fall, the story of England turned decisively toward the Tudors. The third reality was the enduring lesson the battle taught Henry himself, that noble support was dangerously unstable and could determine the fate of a king. From that lesson grew the policies that defined his reign. Henry's kingship reshaped the monarchy in ways that would echo long after his death. He transformed a position that had been vulnerable to noble intrigue into one that rested on firmer foundations of finance, law, and symbolism. He curbed the power of magnates not through constant warfare, but through bonds, recognizances, and legal restrictions that made loyalty profitable and disloyalty ruinous. By controlling noble military retainers and strengthening the authority of the crown's courts, he shifted the balance of power decisively toward the monarchy. What Bosworth had shown him, that kingship was insecure when dependent on the goodwill of powerful lords, he corrected by building a structure that left the nobility dependent on him. His reign also demonstrated the importance of legitimacy constructed through narrative. Henry's blood claim was weak, but he compensated by shaping the story of his kingship. His marriage to Elizabeth of York symbolized reconciliation, and the Tudor rose became the visual emblem of unity. He portrayed himself as the king who ended civil war, the man who delivered England from the instability of feuding houses. The rewriting of Richard III as a villain and himself as savior was not an accident, but a conscious shaping of memory. The effectiveness of this strategy is clear when we see how firmly it took root in later literature and culture. Shakespeare's image of Richard as the scheming hunchback tyrant was possible only because Henry and his supporters had prepared the ground for such an interpretation. Thus, Henry's reign was not only about power in practice, but about power in perception. Financial independence was another crucial part of the monarchy Henry built. By careful management of royal revenues, relentless pursuit of fines, and avoidance of unnecessary wars, he left behind a treasury far stronger than that of his predecessors. In doing so, he made the crown less reliant on Parliament and less beholden to the magnates. This allowed his son Henry VIII to begin his reign with confidence and resources, launching ambitious policies that would reshape the church and state. Without the financial prudence of Henry VII, the expansive monarchy of his son would not have been possible. The long-term influence of Bosworth is seen in the endurance of the Tudor dynasty. From that battlefield victory grew a line of monarchs who would rule for more than a century, presiding over transformations that touched every aspect of English life. The consolidation Henry achieved allowed his successors to act boldly, whether in matters of religion, exploration, or cultural patronage. His reign may lack the drama of his son's break with Rome or his granddaughter Elizabeth's defense against the Spanish Armada, but without the stability he created, those later triumphs would not have been achievable. Bosworth, therefore, was not just the end of a war, but the foundation of an age. The cultural memory of the battle and its aftermath has also played a role in shaping how the English understand their history. For centuries, Bosworth has been remembered as the moment when tyranny was overthrown and peace restored. Even as historians have reevaluated Richard III, pointing out that he may have been more capable and less monstrous than tradition suggests, the symbolism of Bosworth has endured. The discovery of Richard's remains in Leicester in the early 21st century reignited interest in his life and reign. Yet even then, the focus inevitably turned back to the battlefield where his story ended and Henry's began. The site of Bosworth has become not only a place of historical interest, but a symbol of renewal. Henry's reign shows us how the legacy of a single battle can extend far beyond its immediate outcome. The clash at Bosworth lasted only a few hours, yet its consequences shaped more than a century of English history. By turning victory into legitimacy, by reshaping the monarchy into an institution less dependent on the whims of nobles, and by ensuring the continuation of his dynasty through marriage and heirs, Henry ensured that the battle would be remembered as the true end of the medieval struggle for the crown. His dynasty became associated not with constant conflict, but with stability and growth. As we reflect on Bosworth and Henry's reign, it becomes clear that the battle was not simply a military contest, but a hinge point in history. It ended one era and began another. The Plantagenets, with their long legacy of glory and turmoil, gave way to the Tudors, who would preside over a kingdom that emerged stronger, richer, and more centralized. Henry's careful, sometimes ruthless, but always deliberate approach laid the foundation for modern kingship. His victory was not only in surviving the battlefield, but in surviving the years that followed, transforming conquest into enduring rule. The lasting influence of Bosworth is thus twofold. Politically, it reshaped the monarchy, ensuring that the crown emerged stronger than it had been for generations. Culturally, it entered the imagination as a story of redemption and renewal, a narrative of good triumphing over evil, however simplistic that image might be. Even today, when scholars debate the true nature of Richard III or reassess the methods of Henry VII, the importance of that August day in 1485 remains unquestioned. It was the moment when the wars that had torn the realm apart were finally stilled, and when a new dynasty, born of battle but sustained by caution and vision, began to shape the destiny of England.